She was subjected to humiliation, pelted with insults, and they even conspired to have her fired. But who could have possibly guessed that this seemingly inconsequential cleaner was, in fact, the very woman who owned the entire company? Now, those who once laughed at her are about to bid farewell to their careers. True justice is about to be served. A low hum of tension filled the boardroom, a frequency Ilara felt more than heard as she guided her mop and bucket across the polished floor. Her motions were a study in control, smooth, measured, almost hypnotic. Yet behind her calm facade, her mind was a whirlwind of activity, capturing every hushed conversation, cataloging each fleeting expression, mapping the unseen currents of power that flowed through the room. She wasn't merely a cleaner, she was the architect of this empire, the woman who owned the very steel and glass that surrounded them. She was the silent proprietor of the corporation they served, a ghost in the machine who had chosen to sheath her title of CEO, to understand the rot that had taken root in her newest acquisition. From her vantage point in the periphery, she observed the men in their tailored suits, most of whom were utterly oblivious to her, their gazes locked on a strategy to bleed the company for short-term gains. They debated which departments to sever, which roles to eliminate, how to artfully frame the impending collapse as a necessary, if unfortunate, corporate restructuring. None suspected that their own professional fates were being weighed and measured by the one person whose decision was truly final. Ilara had acquired this corporation months prior, pulling it back from the precipice of utter ruin. Once a titan in the tech world, the company had been brought to its knees by rampant mismanagement, by ego-driven decrees, by a catastrophic failure to innovate. What had seized her attention most profoundly when she first examined the company's records wasn't the hemorrhaging financials or the plummeting market share. It was the chilling, systemic disregard for its people, the brazen neglect of the very individuals who formed the bedrock of its past triumphs. The choice to adopt the guise of a janitor was not a whim. Ilara had spent a lifetime ascending from the bottom, born into a world of scarcity where she had learned early and often how the powerful overlook those they deem insignificant. She had constructed her empire from the ground up, fueled by relentless hours and an unyielding will, proving her worth in boardrooms where many saw only her gender or the color of her skin. The hard-won lessons of humility and perseverance were the very crucible that had forged her for this precise moment. It had been 2 weeks since she first picked up the mop and bucket, 2 weeks of immersion in the same ugly currents of casual prejudice, of biting side remarks and dismissive gestures. The moment she donned the janitor's uniform, she became invisible to the very people whose careers she now governed. Ilara knew, with a certainty born of experience, the vital importance of understanding the true sickness within her company, a sickness not found on spreadsheets or in executive summaries, but in the unfiltered words of its workforce. She knelt, wiping a dark stain of spilled coffee from the floor, as the voices in the room sharpened in pitch. "We simply cannot sustain these benefits packages at the current rate," declared a senior executive, a tall man with an icy demeanor, his voice dripping with detached arrogance. "If we slash 20% of the lower-level staff, we can generate enough savings to appease the board for another quarter." A murmur of consensus rippled through the room as several heads nodded, their eyes glued to the cold, hard charts on the display. Ilara's heart constricted. She had seen this destructive playbook enacted time and time again. Layoffs that savaged the most vulnerable, cuts that left the workforce hollowed out and demoralized. The company was being cannibalized from within, with no regard for the long-term devastation of these choices. One of the men, Griffin Croft, a mid-level manager whose ambition vastly outstripped his talent, cast a fleeting glance in Ilara's direction before rolling his eyes. "These janitors," he murmured, his words a venomous whisper meant only for those nearby. "We could cut them too. Frankly, they're a luxury. I don't understand why we need so many." The remark landed like a physical blow, yet Ilara maintained a mask of serene neutrality, continuing to polish a nearby table. She had weathered far worse in her life, but the ease with which some people could strip others of their humanity when they believed no one of consequence was listening never ceased to astonish her. Alara was not here to spar with petty insults. She was on a mission. She had to comprehend the full extent of the decay in this company, and every day spent at the bottom of the ladder revealed just how deep the corrosion ran. Later that day, in the sterile confines of the breakroom, Alara sat in solitude at a small circular table, her hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug of coffee. All around her other employees congregated, their gossip and laughter filling the air, utterly unaware of her true identity, treating her as if she were just another piece of the room's worn furniture. A woman named Bianca, an administrative assistant, leaned against a counter, her voice carrying as she laughed with her colleagues. "Have you heard about that new janitor?" she asked, her volume calibrated to ensure Ilara would overhear. "She's so quiet, you know. Barely says a thing. I bet she doesn't even speak English." A wave of cruel laughter followed the remark, but Ilara remained perfectly still, her face an unreadable canvas. The comments were a familiar sting, and she had learned long ago to let such ignorance slide off her like water. But it wasn't the personal insult that troubled her most. It was the crushing complacency. Not one person challenged the casual racism. Not one person spoke up for the janitor who, in their collective judgment, was unworthy of even a moment's consideration. It was in these quiet moments of observation that Ilara felt the immense weight of her masquerade. The disdain from those surrounding her was a tangible force, but it was also providing her with priceless insight. She now understood the corporate culture wasn't merely flawed, it was septic from the core. She would have to do far more than just reorganize departments and recalibrate financial models. She would have to surgically remove the cancer and rebuild the company's entire moral spine. As dusk settled and the office halls emptied, Ilara finished her shift. The building transformed at night, assuming a quiet, almost reverent stillness. She paused before the CEO's office, her eyes fixed on the gleaming brass nameplate that still bore the name of her predecessor. In a matter of weeks, that plate would display her name, and with that change would come a reckoning no one could possibly foresee. For now, however, she would remain the observer, the listener, the silent recipient of their humiliations and petty slights. She knew that when the moment of truth arrived, every single person who had treated her with contempt would finally see her for who she was. And in that singular moment, the entire balance of power would irrevocably shift. Ilara drew in a deep, cleansing breath and turned from the office door, making her way toward the exit. The night air was cool and sharp against her skin, a welcome antidote to the oppressive tension she had absorbed throughout the day. As she walked toward her car, she couldn't escape the thought of the gathering storm. They would never see it coming. They never did. But she was ready. She had always been ready. The following day began as all the others had, with Ilara slipping into her janitor's uniform and melting into the office, unseen. But this time, she felt the gravity of her purpose more intensely than ever before. The scorn, the casual prejudice, it was all part of a diseased system she would soon eradicate. For now, she had to endure, because real change, lasting change, never happens in an instant. It demands patience, and Ilara had mastered the art of patience a long, long time ago. As she pushed her mop along the corridor, she knew, with absolute certainty, that soon the very people who now ignored her would be desperately pleading for her attention. The morning sun sliced through the vast glass panes of the corporate headquarters as Ilara once again became an invisible cog in the company's machinery. The moment she entered the corridors in her janitor's uniform, it was as if she had wrapped herself in a cloak of absolute imperceptibility. To the employees hurrying past, she was not a person with thoughts, with feelings, with a story. She was simply the janitor. This reality was etched into her mind day after grueling day, as her resolve and fortitude were tested in ways that would have shattered a less resilient spirit. Today was no different. As she guided her cleaning cart into a conference room, a cluster of employees was already there, their conversation animated as they discussed the ever-present threat of layoffs. Ilara maneuvered to the far side of the expansive room, sweeping the floor with a deliberate, unhurried rhythm, hoping to remain unnoticed long enough to absorb more of their candid perspectives. "I heard they're planning to cut another 15% of the workforce," one woman said, her voice laced with anxiety. It was Bianca again, the same administrative assistant who had mocked Ilara only the day before. "I bet you half of these janitors will be gone soon. I mean, can you imagine? They're hardly essential as it is." The casual cruelty in her tone was a painfully familiar echo to Ilara. It was the same dismissive attitude she had faced her entire life, from people who foolishly believed a person's value was dictated by their job title. She held her silence, concentrating on her task as they continued their talk, laughing as they gambled on who would be the next to be terminated. Griffin Croft, the overreaching mid-level manager who had sneered at the necessity of janitors previously, chimed in with his own brand of arrogance. "Honestly, I don't see why we retain so many. They just wander around as if they're important. But I've never seen them do a single thing that would justify keeping more than one or two for the entire building." Ilara's jaw tightened, but her expression remained a placid mask. She understood all too well how effortlessly people like Griffin made sweeping, thoughtless judgments about others. They were so utterly consumed by their own ambition, their own inflated sense of superiority, that they were blind to the worth of anyone who didn't conform to their narrow definition of success. As the day wore on, Ilara's encounters with her colleagues only became more degrading. In the breakroom, she occupied her usual solitary table, nursing her coffee from the same chipped mug. The space buzzed with idle chatter as other employees gathered in cliques, laughing and dissecting their weekend plans. Ilara had trained herself to filter out their noise, but today their words felt sharper, more invasive. A young intern named Leo stood by the coffee machine, speaking loudly to his friends. "I just don't get why they keep so many janitors on staff. I mean, how difficult can it be to clean an office? They just push mops and wipe down tables, right? My own grandmother could do that job." A burst of laughter encircled him, and Ilara felt her grip tighten on her mug's handle. She had long ago learned to withstand comments like these, to let them glance off her without leaving a visible mark. But inside, she felt the familiar burn of being reduced to a caricature, of being judged entirely by the uniform she wore. Leo then turned, his eyes flicking over Ilara as if she were an inanimate object. "I mean, just look at her. Doesn't even talk to anyone. Probably doesn't speak a word of English." More laughter followed, and Ilara kept her gaze fixed on her coffee, denying them the satisfaction of seeing her react. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, a slow burn of anger just beneath the surface, but she forced it back down. These people had no concept of who she was, of what she was capable of. They had no idea that the woman they were so casually deriding was the very person who would soon hold the entirety of their professional lives in the palm of her hand. The afternoon brought a continuation of the same wearying theme. As Ilara moved through the office performing her duties, the condescension became almost a physical weight. Griffin Croft, as dismissive as ever, beckoned her over while he remained seated at his desk, his eyes glued to his computer monitor. "Hey, you!" he called out, not even deigning to look up as he gestured vaguely in her direction. "The trash can here is overflowing. Why don't you handle that?" Ilara approached with a calm, measured stride, her expression a careful blank. She glanced at the wastebasket. It was not even half full. She could feel the stares of other employees on her as Griffin continued to scroll through his emails, pointedly ignoring her presence with a practiced air of superiority. With an efficiency born of habit, she removed the bag from the can, tied it securely, and replaced it with a fresh one. She uttered no word, but the silence that hung between them was thick with unspoken meaning. As she turned to walk away, she overheard Griffin mutter to a nearby colleague, "I swear these people are so slow. No sense of urgency at all. They probably think they deserve a raise just for showing up." The words trailed behind her, echoing in her mind. She had heard it all before. The dismissal, the dehumanization, the casual prejudice that was woven into the very fabric of this workplace. It was a depressingly familiar refrain in the symphony of her life, a melody she had been forced to listen to since she was a child. But Ilara knew something that Griffin and the others did not. Endurance was not weakness. It was a formidable strength. Later that evening, after the office had emptied and the last employee had departed, Ilara found herself alone again. She stood before the CEO's office, the door still marked with the name of the man she had replaced. In just a few short weeks, her own name would be there, and the very people who had treated her as an afterthought would finally comprehend the gravity of their actions. But for now, she was still the janitor, still invisible, and that was precisely the advantage she needed. As she walked through the silent halls, she reflected on the lessons she had learned over a lifetime about patience, about perseverance, and about the immense power of silence. The people here had no clue who she was, and that ignorance gave her a strategic edge they could never fathom. Elara had endured far worse in her life. The insults and the casual bigotry were nothing new. What mattered was the final outcome, and Elara had always been a master of the long game. She pushed her cart toward the exit, the cool night air a welcome touch on her skin as she stepped outside. The quiet of the evening provided a stark contrast to the relentless noise of the day, and as she walked to her car, she allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. In just a few weeks, the dynamics of power would be completely inverted. The people who had scorned her would soon find themselves at her mercy, and Elara would finally have the chance to enact the profound change this company so desperately needed. But change required time, and for now she had to continue playing her part. The next day, the tension in the office was electric. Rumors of layoffs were now spreading like a contagion, and a palpable unease settled over the employees, all of them uncertain of what their future held. Elara knew the time for observation was ending, and the time for action was drawing near. She had gathered sufficient intelligence, she had withstood enough humiliation, and now it was time to execute the next phase of her plan. As she stepped into the office, her mind was laser-focused on the impending board meeting. The executives would gather to discuss the company's future, and Elara knew their proposed solutions would only accelerate the decline. But this time, she would not be a silent observer. This time, she would make her voice heard. The storm was here, and Elara was ready to command it. The morning arrived under a blanket of gray clouds, casting a somber light through the towering glass walls of the office building. The typical energetic buzz of the corporate corridors had been replaced by a muted, anxious hum, filled with hushed murmurs and worried speculation. Elara, clad in her familiar janitor's uniform, moved through the building just as she had for weeks, but today felt fundamentally different. A sense of finality hung in the air, a tension that vibrated through every quiet exchange, every nervous conversation. The rumors of layoffs had reached a fever pitch, and whispers of imminent disaster grew more insistent with each passing minute. Today, everything was going to change. Elara understood that this day would be a pivotal moment, not just for the company, but for her own journey. The scheduled board meeting would seal the corporation's fate, as the executives convened once more to make decisions that would ripple through hundreds of lives. They would debate layoffs, they would propose budget cuts, they would consider shuttering entire departments. Elara had witnessed this tragic play before. Executives scrambling to protect their own careers by sacrificing the livelihoods of those they considered expendable. As she pushed her cleaning cart along the hallway, she felt a complex mix of anticipation and steely resolve. She had tolerated the condescending remarks, the casual bigotry, the utter invisibility, all for this one moment. This was about more than saving a company. It was about proving a fundamental truth to herself, to every employee, and to the world. She had diagnosed the sickness from within, and now it was time to perform the surgery. The boardroom, with its sleek leather chairs and a long, imposing glass table, was already buzzing with activity when Elara slipped in to begin her cleaning routine. The meeting was still an hour away, but the executives were already there, gathered in anxious clusters, discussing the unfolding crisis in hushed, urgent tones. Elara recognized most of them by now, the same faces that had consistently looked right through her, dismissing her as irrelevant, as nothing more than a part of the scenery. Griffin Croft, predictably, was holding court, his loud, confident voice slicing through the nervous chatter. He was in the middle of what he likely considered a rousing speech to some other senior managers, though his tone was far more self-aggrandizing than inspiring. "We're going to have to make some extremely difficult decisions today," he announced, crossing his arms with a smug, self-satisfied smirk. "But it is for the ultimate good of the company. We simply cannot afford to keep all these unnecessary people on the payroll. It's time we trim the fat." Several others nodded their assent, and Ilara felt a hot surge of anger as she methodically wiped down the vast conference table. Unnecessary people. That was the term they used for their employees, as if they were inanimate objects to be discarded, as if their families and their futures meant nothing. She had seen the raw fear and deep uncertainty etched on the faces of the lower-level staff, the very people who would be crushed under the weight of the decisions made in this room. Croft, as oblivious to her presence as ever, pressed on. "The janitorial staff alone could be cut by at least half. We don't need this many people to keep a place clean. Hell, I'll bet we could outsource the entire department and save ourselves a fortune." Ilara kept her gaze locked on the table, her jaw tight. She had heard more than enough over the past weeks to understand the true character of these men. She saw how easily they dehumanized those beneath them, reducing them to mere numbers on a spreadsheet, statistics in a quarterly report. But today, her silence would end. The hour evaporated, and soon the room was full as the remaining executives took their places around the table. As the meeting was formally called to order, Ilara retreated to a corner of the room, melting into the background, her presence as the janitor completely ignored by the powerful men and women who were about to determine the fate of so many. The CEO, a man named Alistair Finch, stood at the head of the table, his face a grim mask. "We are in serious trouble," he began, foregoing any preamble. "Our projections for the next quarter are even worse than we feared. If we don't take immediate and drastic action, we are looking at a total institutional collapse. We need to cut costs across the board, and that means layoffs. Deep, painful layoffs." Ilara listened intently as the discussion began, each executive offering their own variation of the same fatally flawed strategy. They spoke of slashing jobs, closing divisions, and gutting benefits. Not once did a single person mention innovation, or growth, or investing in the very people who made the company function. It was all about self-preservation, about cutting corners to save their own positions while willfully ignoring the catastrophic long-term consequences. "I propose we begin with the administrative staff," one executive stated, shuffling a stack of papers before him. "We could reduce their numbers by at least 25%. That should give us the breathing room we need for the next quarter." "And the janitorial staff," Griffin Croft added instantly. "We can outsource that entirely. There's no logical reason to keep them on the payroll when we can hire a third-party service to do the same job for half the price." Ilara's hand tightened around the handle of her mop until her knuckles were white. She had heard enough. She knew now, with chilling certainty, that if she did not intervene, this company would plummet into an entirely preventable disaster. The decisions being made here today were not about saving the company. They were about saving the careers of the executives at the expense of everyone else. For weeks, she had kept her true identity a closely guarded secret, observing, learning, and mapping the full scope of the dysfunction. But now the time for secrets was over. It was time to reveal the truth. Ilara was ready to seize control, but she knew she had to do it with surgical precision, not with raw emotion. As the executives continued their grim debate, Ilara quietly placed her mop against the wall and walked with a steady, deliberate pace to the head of the table where Alistair Finch stood. She tapped him gently on the shoulder, her heart hammering against her ribs as she prepared to shatter the illusion she had so carefully maintained. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but resonant. Finch turned, startled by the interruption, his brow creasing in confusion as he looked at the unfamiliar woman before him. "Yes, what is it?" Ilara met his gaze directly, without a flicker of hesitation. "I believe it's time that I had a word." The room plunged into an immediate shocked silence. Every eye was suddenly fixed on her. The executives traded bewildered glances, utterly baffled by the janitor who now stood at the head of their table. Griffin Croft, ever the opportunist, was the first to find his voice. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is a private meeting. You have absolutely no business being here." Ilara ignored his tone completely. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her uniform and withdrew a small, crisp envelope. the very envelope that contained the legal documentation of her complete ownership of the corporation. She had been waiting for this exact moment, waiting to see just how far they would push before she unveiled her hand. "I think you'll find," she said, her voice a calm counterpoint to the rising tension, "that I have every right to be in this room." She handed the envelope to Alistair Finch. "And as of this moment, I will be the one making the decisions that determine this company's future." Finch stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake before tearing it open. He scanned the documents within, and all the color drained from his face as he read the words confirming Alara as the corporation's majority shareholder. He looked up at her, his voice a choked whisper. This can't be real." "Oh, it's very real," Alara replied, her voice gaining strength as she addressed the entire room. "I have owned this company for weeks, and in that time, I have been watching, listening, and learning everything about how it is being run into the ground. And I have heard enough to know that the decisions you are about to make will utterly destroy it." The room exploded into a cacophony of chaos as executives shouted over one another, struggling to process what was happening. Griffincroft was the loudest, his face a mask of crimson fury as he shot up from his chair. "You can't do this! You're just a janitor!" Ilara turned to face him, her gaze as cold and hard as diamond. "I am not just anything. I am the woman who now controls your career, your salary, and the future of this entire company. And I will be making absolutely certain that people like you, people who believe they can walk all over others without any consequence, are held accountable for their actions." The room fell silent once more, the weight of her words pressing down on them all. Alara looked around at the stunned faces of the executives who had ignored her, mocked her, and dehumanized her for weeks. She had endured their arrogance, their prejudice, and their willful ignorance, and now she stood before them as their boss. The consequences of Ilara's revelation were both immediate and absolute. As she took her rightful place at the head of the boardroom table, the entire gravitational field of the room tilted on its axis. The executives who had, just moments before, wielded absolute authority were now desperately scrambling to salvage their careers. But Ilara had no interest in preserving the old, corrupt hierarchy. She was here to excise the rot that had taken hold of this company and to rebuild it from its very foundations. Her first act was decisive and clear: to ensure that those who had cultivated the toxic culture would no longer be a part of its future. Griffincroft and others who shared his mindset would soon discover their employment had been terminated, and Ilara would begin the arduous but necessary process of transforming the company into an environment where every single employee, regardless of their position, was treated with dignity and respect. The boardroom remained suspended in a state of stunned silence, the air thick with a tension so profound it was almost difficult to breathe, as the full weight of Ilara's declaration settled over them. Her gaze swept across the room, meeting every pair of shocked, disbelieving eyes with a serene, unyielding confidence. She could see the utter disbelief etched on their faces, the cognitive dissonance of trying to reconcile the woman they had dismissed as a mere janitor with the person who now held their professional lives in her hands. For weeks they had regarded her with utter contempt, never once entertaining the possibility that she was the true force of power within the company. And now, in an instant, their entire world had been upended. Ilara allowed the silence to stretch, to deepen, relishing the tectonic shift in power. The very individuals who had belittled and mocked her were now entirely at her mercy, and the dawning realization of this fact was written on their faces. The air crackled with a volatile mix of fear, confusion, and impotent rage, but no one dared to speak. Not yet. Griffincroft, his face still flushed a deep red from his earlier outburst, was the one to finally break the spell. He shot up from his chair, his fists clenched at his sides, his eyes blazing with a desperate fury. "This is absurd!" "Hi," he yelled, his voice cracking under the strain. "You're a janitor! You can't just walk in here and pretend you own this company." Ilara turned to him slowly, her expression unblemished by emotion, her voice as steady and sharp as tempered steel. "But I do own this company, Griffin. I've owned it for weeks, long before you ever noticed I was even in the room. And during that time, I have seen exactly how you and others who think like you treat the people who actually make this company operate." Croft's face contorted with anger, but a new emotion was now visible behind it: raw fear. He knew what was coming, even if he couldn't yet bring himself to accept it. Elara took a deliberate step toward him, her voice dropping to a quiet but firm register. "For weeks, I have watched you demean and belittle the people who work here. You called them unnecessary. You said they didn't matter. Well, now you are going to learn precisely what it feels like to be the one who is deemed irrelevant." Griffin opened his mouth to retort, but before he could form a single word, Elara raised a hand, silencing him with the simple gesture. "You're fired," she stated, her tone devoid of all emotion, her eyes locking onto his. "Effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The color drained from Croft's face as the finality of her words struck him like a physical blow. "You can't do this," he sputtered, his voice now laced with panic. "I have been with this corporation for years. I know how things are run here." Elara met his panicked gaze without flinching. "And that is precisely why you are being dismissed. You have been here far too long, Griffin, long enough to believe you were untouchable. But you are not. No one is." Before Croft could muster another protest, two uniformed security guards entered the boardroom, positioning themselves by the door as Elara gave them a subtle nod. "Please escort Mr. Croft out of the building," she instructed, her tone leaving no room for argument. The guards moved toward Griffin, who desperately scanned the room for an ally, but no one met his gaze. They were all too stunned, too afraid of sharing his fate. Griffin muttered a stream of curses under his breath as the guards led him away, but his protests were feeble, his bravado utterly shattered. As the door clicked shut behind him, the room remained shrouded in a palpable silence. Elara turned back to the remaining executives, her expression unreadable. "Now," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a surgeon's scalpel, "let's discuss the future of this company." Alistair Finch, still seated at the head of the table, cleared his throat, clearly shaken by the sudden and dramatic turn of events. "Miss Sanders," he began, his voice cautious, "if I may ask, what exactly are your plans? I believe we are all a bit uncertain about the new direction you intend to take." Elara nodded slowly, her gaze sweeping across the room as she began to speak. "My intentions are quite simple. This company has been in a free fall for months, and the decisions you have been making are accelerating it toward total collapse. I purchased this corporation to save it, but I cannot accomplish that while the same toxic leadership remains in place." Her words hung in the air, their implication unmistakable. She wasn't just here to shuffle a few positions, she was here to perform a complete cultural overhaul. For far too long, this company has been managed by individuals who believe they can treat other human beings as disposable, Elara continued. "You speak of cutting jobs and outsourcing entire departments as if it's a simple business calculation, but you have forgotten that behind every single number is a person. You have forgotten that the success of this enterprise depends on every person who works here. Not just the executives, but the janitors, the administrative staff, and the workers on the factory floor." Her words were measured, controlled, yet the passion fueling them was undeniable. She had spent her entire career fighting against the very brand of elitism and arrogance she had witnessed within these walls, and now, finally, she had the power to eradicate it. "The way this company has been run is fundamentally unacceptable," Elara stated, her voice firm, "and starting today, that changes." For the next hour, Elara meticulously laid out her vision for the company's future. She detailed her plans for restructuring, not through layoffs and austerity, but by investing in the very employees who had been so long overlooked. She spoke of innovation, of sustainable growth, and of long-term stability, concepts that had been conspicuously absent from the discussions led by the former leadership. Some of the executives listened in a state of quiet shock, still struggling to process the seismic shift in command. Others, clearly terrified of losing their own jobs, nodded along eagerly, desperate to signal their support for the new regime. But Elara was not interested in sycophants. She wanted genuine change, and she knew that meant clearing out the deadwood at the very top. By the time the meeting concluded, several more executives had been quietly let go, their severance packages already drawn up. Ilara had no patience for those who could not or would not adapt to her vision, and she made it abundantly clear that anyone unwilling to embrace the new culture would be shown the door. Later that evening, long after the last of the executives had departed, Ilara walked through the now empty and silent halls. The office already felt different, quieter, calmer, almost peaceful. She knew that the changes she had set in motion today were merely the beginning. There was a mountain of work still to be done, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a profound sense of achievement. As she passed the office where her nameplate would soon be installed, she paused for a moment, reflecting on the long and arduous journey that had brought her to this place. She had endured weeks of humiliation and disrespect, but it had all been for this. She had seen the true character of the people who had once wielded power in this company, and now they were gone. But more importantly, Ilara had proven something to herself. She had always known she possessed the strength to succeed, but now she had the power to fundamentally change the lives of the people who worked for her. She had the opportunity to build a company where every single person was valued, where no one was ever treated as disposable. As she stood in the quiet hallway, she allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. The storm had come, the storm had passed, and Ilara had emerged victorious. A week later, the company was alive with a newfound energy. News of the changes Ilara had implemented had spread like wildfire, and the employees, the very ones who had lived in fear for their jobs, were now filled with a cautious but growing sense of optimism about their future. The toxic culture that had once poisoned the office was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, and in its place, something new and healthy was beginning to grow. Ilara sat in her new office, the breathtaking vista of the city skyline stretching out before her. On her desk lay a stack of files, each one representing a fresh opportunity, a new path forward for the company. She had always held the conviction that true leadership was not about titles or power, but about the positive impact you have on the people around you. And now she had the chance to lead by example. As she picked up the first file, ready to immerse herself in the work ahead, there was a soft knock on her door. It was one of the janitors, a young woman who had been hired only a few days prior. She smiled nervously, clearly hesitant about disturbing the CEO, but Ilara waved her in warmly. "Don't worry," Ilara said, her voice full of kindness. "What can I do for you?" The young woman paused for a moment before speaking. I wanted to say thank you for everything you've done. I've never worked anywhere where people like me were treated with respect." Ilara's heart swelled with pride and she smiled. "You're welcome. And please remember, everyone here deserves respect, no matter what their job title is." The woman nodded and left, and Ilara leaned back in her chair, feeling a deep and profound sense of satisfaction. The work was only just beginning, but she knew with absolute certainty that together they would build something truly remarkable. And this time, no one would ever be left behind.